Bonjour tout le monde. J'ai cru comprendre qu'il y avait quelques questions pour moi aujourd'hui. Plaisir.
En quoi vous avez trouvé la sortie de Mme Thomas offensante aujourd'hui?
Je suis francophone, je viens du Québec. J'ai passé ma vie à défendre la langue française. J'ai étudié en littérature française et québécoise. Je trouve ça très insultant. On a la chance d'être dans un pays qui a 2 langues officielles. Ça en fait toute sa richesse. Puis on a la chance de travailler à la Chambre des communes où on a accès à de la traduction simultanée, où on a tous les services pour être capable de comprendre nos collègues, peu importe la langue dans laquelle ils s'expriment. Je vais continuer de parler en français ici parce que c'est ma langue de travail, puis je suis francophone et c'est plus naturel pour moi d'expliquer dans mes mots et de répondre adéquatement aux questions qui me sont posées en français. C'est un privilège parlementaire, puis je vais continuer de le faire. C'était très déplacé, puis très méprisant aussi à l'endroit des francophones puis des Québécois.
Avez-vous l'impression que ça démontre un problème plus large?
Concernant la personne ou le parti?
Non, et même plus largement encore.
À la Chambre des communes, je pense que tout le monde apprécie cette richesse-là de la Chambre de pouvoir s'exprimer en français ou en anglais. Mais je trouve ça problématique qu'en 2023, il y a un parti politique qui ne semble pas comprendre cette importance-là de la dualité linguistique et aussi du fait français, puis qu'on ait des commentaires comme ça, c'est complètement déplacé.
In English, what did you think of Rachael Thomas asking you to speak in English?
I thought it was inappropriate. We are in a country that has 2 official languages, French and English. I'm a Francophone, and I have the privilege as a parliamentarian to express myself in my mother tongue. And I will continue to do so, and I will never question one of my colleagues who wants to speak French or English. We have translation also, so I thought it was really inappropriate and disrespectful to French people and Quebec people.
Êtes-vous d'accord avec le ministre Mathieu Lacombe qui dit que CBC Radio-Canada devrait être exclu et ne toucher aucun argent de C-18?
Je pense qu'il faut distinguer les enjeux, OK? L'entente, en fait, la loi gouvernementale indique que les médias qui font du journalisme sont éligibles. CBC Radio-Canada en fait assurément. Maintenant, c'est une entente qui va lier Google, qui est une plateforme en ligne, avec les médias canadiens. Je pense que c'est un mauvais message de dire que le contenu produit par un diffuseur public n'importe où dans le monde n'aurait pas de valeur pour les plateformes digitales, pour les géants du Web. Je pense que c'est envoyer le mauvais message. Maintenant, ça ne veut pas dire... CBC Radio-Canada représente à peu près le tiers de la force journalistique au Canada. Je suis tout à fait consciente de la dynamique puis des difficultés de nos médias sur le marché, puis on va le prendre en considération dans la réglementation finale. Je ne pense pas que CBC Radio-Canada devrait partir avec le tiers de l'enveloppe. Donc, on va adresser ça dans les réglementations finales qui vont être publiées peu de temps avant la mise en œuvre de la loi. Fait que je demande un petit peu de patience là, sur le détail de comment tout ça va fonctionner.
Il y a aussi des gens qui disent que ça n'aurait pas de bon sens que CBC Radio-Canada touche une partie de l'enveloppe de Google compte tenu du 1,2 milliard que le télédiffuseur public reçoit. Pour vous, c'est pas aussi clair que ça?
Dans la réalité, il y a beaucoup de soutien gouvernemental qui est donné aussi aux médias d'information au Canada au complet par des mesures fiscales, entre autres, le crédit d'impôt sur la masse salariale. Il y a aussi par des mesures au CRTC ou les radios. Surtout la télévision est soutenue aussi par divers fonds. Donc, je pense qu'il faut prendre ça avec un grain de sel. Par contre, oui, la réalité du marché est très difficile présentement, surtout pour les médias privés. Et on va tenir ça en considération dans la réglementation finale.
How will a per journalist distribution of this $100 million help smaller outlets who need this money? Won't it go towards larger outlets that have lots of journalists?
No, the legislation is very clear about the fact that any eligible media that fits the criteria can raise their hand and say that they want to be part of that collective. The collective will be obligated to represent those media as well, and it's very clear in the legislation that local media, Indigenous media, official languages and minority situation media, and Indigenous media, that they're all part of that legislation.
Don't they just get a little share of it, though? Like,
Well, this is based also on the number of journalists that the media have. So we want to be able to support jobs. We want to be able to support those that produce the information that Canadian needs, and that is also linked to Google because that's the agreement between the two. So all of this is being considered, but what's very important and what's very different from what was done in Australia and other countries where, like you said, most of the big media get the bigger part of the deals that are agreed upon. Here we made sure that smaller media, independent media were included at the table of discussion.
But as the draft regulation state, most of the money will go to the employers that have the most journalists, which is CBC, Radio Canada. Is there something that will address that in the final regulations?
I think that the way that we should see how this should work in the bill is that it's an incentive for media to hire journalists because this is a new revenues that will be coming to the sector.
Will the final regulations change on that portion as it relates to CBC Radio Canada?
You know, there's a very important process going on right now at Treasury Board. I can go into the details of the regulation. They will be published shortly and will answer. We're taking into account the reality of the market and the fact that this is to support journalism. We want to make sure that the money is reinjected in newsroom and that it doesn't go, for example, to shareholders. All of this is already planned in the legislation, and the regulation will respect the spirit of the legislation.
Monsieur Lacombe demande aussi, si vous permettez, juste une petite dernière. Ouais. Monsieur Lacombe demande aussi que le Québec ait son mot à dire dans la façon dont les fonds seront distribués aux médias.
Je vais rencontrer M. Lacombe dans quelques semaines. On va pouvoir parler de l'avenir des médias puis comment nos gouvernements peuvent travailler ensemble. Mais ça concerne une loi fédérale sur les nouvelles en ligne et c'est une entente qui va être entre Google et le collectif qui va représenter les médias. Ce que le gouvernement fédéral fait, c'est on a passé la loi. Maintenant, on va publier le cadre réglementaire à travers lequel le CRTC va devoir s'assurer que tout ça est fait dans l'esprit de la loi puis en respect des règles. Et c'est comme ça que ça va se passer. Merci.
Vous pensez quoi de Mme Thomas, son intervention avec Mme St-Onge? Mme St-Onge dit que ça montre le peu de considération des conservateurs pour la langue française. Vous êtes d'accord avec ça ou c'est une tempête dans un verre rouge?
Ah non, c'est important, c'est grave. Mme Thomas, on dirait qu'elle ne comprend pas où elle est. C'est extrêmement méprisant pour le français, puis ça va même à l'encontre des droits des parlementaires.
Mais pourtant, quand les journalistes demandent une question en français, les élus, vous répondez en français. Quand c'est en anglais, vous répondez en...
Les députés et les ministres, quand ils témoignent devant un comité, ont le droit de poser des questions dans la langue de leur choix, ils ont le droit de répondre dans la langue de leur choix. C'était tout à fait le droit de Mme St-Onge de répondre en français si elle se sentait plus à l'aise de le faire. Que Mme Thomas, comme ça, la pointe du doigt, on trouve ça, nous, au NPD, extrêmement méprisant envers le français et le respect du français dans les institutions, alors que c'est un droit de bilinguisme qui est acquis.
Avez-vous l'impression que ça démontre un problème plus généralisé?
Bien, est-ce que c'est ça la position du Parti conservateur? Moi, ce que j'aimerais savoir, c'est est-ce que Mme Thomas est prête à s'excuser? Puis est-ce que M. Poilievre est prêt à se dissocier des propos de sa députée?
Est-ce que vous voyez une contradiction entre ce que les conservateurs essayent de mettre de l'avant, de les défenseurs du français, de défendre la langue sur les langues officielles, et après ça, vos interactions?
Bien, ça serait une contradiction flagrante, surtout si M. Godin ne dit rien alors qu'il est le porte-parole en matière de langue officielle. Puis si M. Poilievre ne se dissocie pas clairement des propos de sa députée, ça va montrer qu'il parle des deux côtés de la bouche, puis il y a deux poids, deux mesures au Parti conservateur.
Merci. M. Viss, vous qui êtes aux langues officielles, est-ce que c'est acceptable de demander à un ministre de répondre en anglais, répondre en anglais?
Chaque ministre a le droit de parler dans les deux langues officielles. Ça, c'est le droit des Canadiens.
I've just heard about the litigation, but what I would say is that climate change is disproportionately affecting First Nations people. And as I said in the House earlier, much of this summer, our focus as a government was to support First Nations in just the most extraordinary, dangerous situations where communities were being threatened by wildfire, where evacuations were occurring, oftentimes at very short notice, working with chiefs to ensure they had the proper equipment and support to protect their communities and infrastructure, lots of infrastructure lost. So I'm sure there's, obviously a legal analysis that will be conducted, but the fact remains that we have to continue to work on climate, both from preventing the ongoing rise in temperatures that we're seeing, but also in the readiness for First Nations communities in particular, who are facing all across this country just astronomical challenges related to climate change.
So a lot of those places depend on diesel generators to run their electric grids, and presumably diesel is subject to the some form of carbon pricing. You made a carve out for folks in for anybody who runs an oil furnace to do that. Why wouldn't you be able to do something like that for Northern Ontario chiefs?
Well, the investments that we've been making to get people off diesel is quite significant. Actually, Watay Power, which is 51% owned by First Nations, I think 16 First Nations, has been connecting communities. I was just up in Casablanca as they turned on the lights, so to speak, connecting to the grid. And those kinds of investments in terms of clean energy into communities are critically important. As you know, anybody in remote communities sees a increased rebate through the climate action rebate. And we always ensure that First Nations have all the tools to make sure that people are getting the benefits that they are entitled to as Canadians, including the climate action rebate. But the fact remains that we have to take action, and we'll continue to be there for First Nations as they transform the ways that they power themselves in ways that they feel are appropriate and in ways that actually help support their own economic development, which is exactly the story of Watay Power.
But why a carve out for oil furnaces and not for diesel generators that run the electric grid on many reserves in Northern Ontario?
Listen, obviously the work that we're doing with First Nations is First Nations led, and there are many different kinds of heating scenarios across Northern Ontario, but everyone in Ontario is eligible for the climate action rebate, and we need to continue to work with communities to make sure they're getting that and all of the other federal benefits that they're entitled to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
What do you think about the Northern Ontario Indigenous nations asking to be exempted from the carbon tax?
Well, it's a carbon rebate according to the Supreme Court of Canada, and I understand that First Nations, when they hear the language around tax, but the Supreme Court rejected its characterization as a tax, and if it was a tax, it probably wouldn't have application on reserve, but because it's a rebate, that it goes back to their community members. I know lots of people in my First Nations communities who don't have cars who are getting that rebate.
Okay. So are you saying they don't understand how the program works and they're operating on some incorrect information here? Because they seem to want to not be paying any kind of price on pollution.
Well, I can understand that, but you can see on First Nations Reserve, generally federal and provincial taxes don't apply under the Indian Act. If it was in fact a tax, then it wouldn't be applicable. However, because it's a rebate and those community members, whether they drive a car or not, get it back, I think the question is that they're trying to figure out if their community members, which a lot of First Nation community members don't file income tax because it doesn't apply to them, aren't getting the same benefits. And I guess the question is, how do we ensure First Nations community members in Ontario and all around the world are getting the grocery rebate, or getting the climate incentive rebate, and these are things that we need to work on with the chiefs, and so to have a better understanding of how this program actually works.
Are you going to be? Do they have a point though? Do they? I mean, we saw on the East Coast of Canada.
If it was a tax, they would have a point. But the Supreme Court has said during the carbon tax case that the Conservative premiers put forward that this is not a tax; it's a rebate.
In the East Coast of Canada as well. I mean, people call it a carbon tax there. It's still the same.
I know that media and the Conservatives have framed it that way, but if it was a tax, it would not be applicable under Section 88 of the Indian Act that says generally we don't tax things that are First Nations property. So if it was actually a tax, then they would have very much a point. But because it's a rebate, the Supreme Court has ruled that. I think that they have to look at how better they can have their community members apply for that, rather than to look at it and say, well, this is a tax and it's unconstitutional.
With respect, whether it's a tax or a rebate, they still don't like this.
Okay.
And so is your government willing to listen to them, hear them out, work with them, create some kind of a carve-out as we saw with the East Coast?
Our government will work with First Nations communities to ensure that they understand the program and figure out how they can best benefit from it.
Thank you.
Thank you. What do you make of this court case that, or I guess not really a court case, but this thing that the Northern Ontario Chiefs are bringing in to seek an exemption from the carbon tax?
I think we need to put this in focus of the larger inequity facing Northern First Nations. I mean, Pierre Poilievre, he's never bothered to go into any of these communities. He's never bothered to talk to any of these leaders. He has no concept of what they're facing. The reality is, in many northern communities like Attawapiskat, the price of heating a home is staggering. We have communities that are still on diesel generators. So what the government should have done from the beginning is talk about the energy poverty and address these issues. If people are paying the carbon tax in these communities, they're not getting the rebate that the government talks about. There needs to be a program for First Nation communities who are having to pay sometimes extremely high energy prices and put it at a reasonable cost.
Okay. Jaime Battiste came in through here before, and he was saying that, he didn't actually come out and say it, but he sort of implied that maybe this isn't really, they don't really have any grounds for this case, that basically it's not a tax, so they're not necessarily exempted from it.
Well, I'd be really surprised that the Liberals aren't recognizing the huge inequities faced in northern communities, particularly in my region, Treaty 9. The heating costs are staggering. People are not able to get the same benefit that people in the rest of the country have. People have no opportunity for alternatives. This has been raised again and again and again. It comes down to this federal government's indifference to the huge levels of inequity, whether it's in education, health services, or in being able to heat your home at minus 45-degree temperatures. So
should they be exempted in a similar way that the folks out in the East Coast are being exempted, or not the folks out in the East Coast, but folks who heat with oil?
I think what we're seeing here is a more complex issue in terms of the dependence that the northern communities have, many of them on diesel generators. We don't have a credible heating system that works for First Nation communities. So I think what the federal government needs to do is recognize the inequity, sit down and with the northern chiefs and say, how do we establish fair pricing so that people can afford to heat their homes? And this is very, very different than Pierre Poilievre jumping on this issue. You never heard Pierre Poilievre ever stand up on a First Nation issues before. Now he's axe a tax, axe a tax. It's more complicated than that, and I think we need to find a better solution.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Leah Gazan, and I'm the NDP critic for women and gender equality, and I'm joined today by my colleague Lori Idlout today, and some of our colleagues in the NDP who are behind us in our vote against the Ways and Means motion. We're sending a very clear message to the Liberal government. We are putting them on notice that it is not okay anymore to leave women and gender diverse and Indigenous peoples out in the cold. How many times has MMIWG mentioned in the fall economic statement? 0. This government is cutting $150 million from women's shelters, even though municipalities across this country have called gender-based violence an epidemic. This is unacceptable. So we are sending a clear message to this government, along with our leaders' support, very clear support, that the NDP is standing in solidarity with women and gender diverse people and Indigenous people, and we are saying no more to Liberal neglect. They've had 8 years to deal with it, and they continue to fail. Thank you.
My name is Lori Idlout. I am the Member of Parliament for Nunavut, and I am so thankful to the NDP, to my colleague Leah, and the rest of the party, and to Jagmeet for supporting us in our vote today, because what is happening is the years of injustices is not acceptable. We've been fighting hard the last 2.5 years to make sure that Indigenous people's needs are being met, and the fall economic statement was a clear indication that the Liberals are not willing to do what they can to uplift Indigenous peoples. It is well known that there is a $350 billion infrastructure gap for First Nations. This figure does not even include infrastructure gaps for Métis and for Inuit. There is impending cut cuts to Indigenous Services Canada for programs that impact Indigenous peoples, upwards of $7 billion. Finally, there are settlements, Indigenous claims against the federal government for their rights being infringed. And these figures, the land claims against the Indigenous peoples means that Indigenous peoples have to use the courts to fight for their rights. And this is not right. This is absolutely unacceptable. And I really appreciate the support of the party so that we could show that Indigenous peoples matter in Canada and that we will use our voice to make sure that Indigenous peoples and women are being protected and that Indigenous peoples and women are getting the supports that they need so that we as Indigenous peoples can contribute to Canada's societies as well as our economy.
What would you say to people who say that the carbon tax isn't a tax and therefore shouldn't be considered in this?
We're here today to talk about the plight and ongoing neglect of Indigenous people and women, and that is our focus today. Thank you.
Can you speak a little bit more to the cuts that might be coming to Indigenous services? How might this affect people on the ground, and how might this affect the infrastructure gap given the realities of the climate crisis?
These cuts will keep Indigenous peoples marginalized. These cuts will mean that Indigenous peoples' rights will remain violated and infringed. These cuts will mean that Indigenous peoples will die out in the streets because they have no homes to go to. These cuts will mean that mental health of Indigenous peoples will lead to continued suicides of Indigenous peoples. These cuts will mean that TB will not be addressed because with the constant underfunding, underinvestment, we have diseases that have been eliminated in other parts of the world that will remain high in Indigenous communities. That is what we're saying. These are not acceptable.
Yeah. Would you like to see more members of your caucus vote the same way that you two did?
Our caucus is standing in solidarity. With this vote, we are sending a very clear message to the Liberal government. We are putting them on notice. There is no division in this caucus. We are united in our stance, in solidarity with women, gender diverse people, and Indigenous people, and we are sending a clear message to this government. This is unacceptable. As a caucus, with our leader, who is standing behind Indigenous peoples and is standing behind women and gender diverse people.
You said on notice. What other steps are you willing to take?
Well, this is the first step. Hopefully the Liberals don't test those steps. We are putting them on notice today. No more games.
What have you been told from your Liberal colleagues about these cuts? Was there any forewarning? How do they explain them?
Well, we found that data on their website. Is what we did. It was our staff that found that in their business plans what their plans are. So there was no conversations. It was us finding out through our research what's on their website.
What message do you have for the Ontario chiefs who are challenging the carbon tax? What message do you have for them?
We are focused on ensuring that we're sending a message about Indigenous peoples being uplifted, needing to make sure that we have, as a party, shown that we are here to fight for Indigenous people's rights.
Does that mean you're supporting them?
That is up to, in a nation-to-nation country that's apparently nation-to-nation. It is the Prime Minister's responsibility to have those nation-to-nation discussions with the Ontario chiefs.
Thank you. Thanks. India is striking a high-level executive lead to look into the murder in the United States. Are you and they're consulting with their American partners, I guess, and wondering if you have been, if they're going to be discussing anything to do with the murder of Mr. Nidger.
So again, I am regularly updated by the RCMP and other law enforcement agencies around the work that they're doing to have the government of India properly collaborate with our criminal investigation in Canada. there is an ongoing RCMP investigation in Canada, so I'm obviously not going to comment on the details of these investigations. We've taken note of the U.S. Justice Department filings in the United States yesterday. Again, I had been updated on some of this work by CSIS and the RCMP as far back as last summer, and I know from discussions last evening they continue to be very engaged with a whole series of American partners.
But you haven't heard anything from the Indian government yet?